Hi, everybody. It's Eric Schwartzman. Hopefully you got the update on our guest. We are lucky to have with us today Josh Bernoff. He was an analyst with Forrester for 20 years. Over that period, at that time, I was in public relations, and we did work together on several stories, technology news breaks. And he left in 2015. Since then, he has been advising authors on business books, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about tech PR. Josh, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here, Eric. I'm pleased to be in front of your audience.
So, we'll give people a while to just sort of log in and get settled. So, are you traveling much these days, or are you pretty much doing most of your work there locally?
Yeah, so I work primarily with authors now. That's shifted. And I do some public speaking, so I do go around and talk to folks and occasionally do workshops on clear writing. But when you're working with authors, you can do a lot of it from your desk. So I'm pleased to be here in the woody surrounds of the suburbs of Boston, in this idyllic setting, reading really terrible prose written by smart people and helping to turn it into stuff that's much less terrible.
So what's the deal with that? Why do people struggle? I mean, was it always that way? Or is literacy just sort of a vanishing skill?
No, I think it has always been that way. But there was a time in the past when if people wrote things and they were distributed, that they got a lot of help from editors. Now there's this direct relationship between people and their audiences, and they're used to writing emails which don't get edited and tweets that don't get edited. God, imagine the spelling, right? And so I sort of help people. Some of them are very disciplined thinkers and can't put a sentence together. Some of them write beautiful prose that misses the point. There are so many different ways that people can get sidetracked, and I just try to help people to sort of work on the muscles that they aren't as good at and take advantage of the things that they do know. People are just as smart as they used to be. It's just that being smart and being an excellent writer are not necessarily the same thing.
But you don't think that sort of our shortened attention spans as a result of the immediacy of Google and other technologies has somehow affected our ability to write?
That's an interesting question. I'd say it's affected our ability to read. It actually creates an even greater demand for writers who can be clear and direct and to the point and lead people through a story. I've worked with a writer recently who had a deficiency I didn't even think was possible. He couldn't really figure out what a narrative was. So we had to rearrange the stuff, the insights that he had, so that they actually formed a story from beginning to end. And I'm not sure that that is a consequence of any sort of changes in technology. I just think some people think in different ways. And if you're going to be writing, you have to write as clearly and simply as possible, so that in an attention deficit kind of environment, that you're still able to get your message across.
So many of us in public relations were trained to write by journalism style. Mm-hmm. Is that how you suggest when someone's writing a book, they approach a topic?
Interesting question. So there are elements of journalism that absolutely apply. So, for example, you should only say facts that are true. There's a journalistic standard, which I very much adhere to. And when I work with people and they make statements, I'm like, okay, this can be your opinion. That's fine. But if you state it as a fact, we need to have a source for it. On the other hand, much of writing, and especially books these days, is most effective when you are talking directly to the reader. Let me explain to you what you're going to need to know here. Now, the first thing that we're going to get into is a sort of a conversational style, and journalistic style tends to take a more of a put some distance between the writer and the reader, and that is actually less effective these days. unless you are sort of a magisterial historian kind of person, you're much more likely to succeed if you're talking directly to the reader and using the word "you" to sort of draw them into the challenges that you're trying to solve for them.
And the word I would imagine, even
Well,
though it's implied.
That is a word that is taboo for a lot of people. They learned not to do that when they were in college, but it's definitely necessary. It's interesting at Forrester Research for 20 years, I was not permitted to use the word I in writing because when you had an opinion at Forrester, that was the opinion of Forrester. So you would say, we expect, we believe, our research has shown. This is much more authoritative. Interestingly, when Forrester started to have blogs for its analysts, that started to fall away. And you could say things like, well, when I was at the conference, I met with this executive and he had something very interesting to say. And it really, I think, loosened people up a little bit in terms of their ability to communicate in a way that wasn't so royal, shall we say.
And you're publishing on your own blog almost daily now.
Yes, I publish 5 blog posts a week. Every weekday, every weekday morning, I do that. I started publishing on my own blog, which is at withoutbullshit.com, in March of 2015. I'm sorry, I guess that's not exactly right. No, that's right, March of 2015. And then I continued to publish the next day and the next day. And I said, well, let's see how long that streak can go. And now it's 4.5 years of publishing something of substance every single weekday. But it seems to give me a reason to have, I have to do research. I have to think about what's happening in the world. And I have to have something useful and interesting to say. And that provides some rhythm to this post-employed life that I have.
It's interesting because, so many of the sort of content marketing gurus say that if you're launching a blog that's partly promotional for your business, you should be as niche and as focused as possible. Yet, I noticed on your blog, you have a variety of fairly broad categories. Like you've got Ask Dr. Wobbs, which I imagine is something like an AMA, Ask Me Anything. You've got corporate as a category. You've got marketing. You've got media. You've got politics. So I guess in the time that you've been doing this, what type of content tends to resonate best? Can you say that some categories do better than others?
It is impossible to predict on any given day whether something will actually be resonating with people. The reason there are so many topics is because this blog started out to be about clear writing. It's now shaded in to be a little bit more about problems that authors have. But I was first book I put out was called Writing Without Bullshit, and so that's specifically about clear writing. And when I was analyzing writing, I was analyzing political statements. I was analyzing corporate PR statements, press releases. Really any sort of raw material was possible. And so those categories just reflect the different kinds of writing that I was trying to take apart. It is a single perspective, even if it's a variety of topics. I wouldn't get too far if I had a blog called Analyzing Press Releases and I tried to post on it every day. That would be really tedious. What I didn't expect was that there would be such a wealth of information from the political sphere, but then none of us expected what happened in the 2016 election and the run up to it, which really is an enormous amount of fodder if you're looking at clear communication and how communication works.
Let's come back to that. I want to talk about the fact that you created that you wrote a book called Writing Without Bullshit, and you came from 20 years as a tech industry analyst. I've got to think that there was some connection to your role fielding pitches as a tech PR analyst and your inertia for this book.
Well, there's a few connections here. Looking specifically at what you said about tech PR, I estimated that in the 20 years that I spent at Forrester Research, I received 10,000 press releases. And I did a little math and tried to determine just how many of the words in those press releases were actually relevant and useful to me. And it's 0.02% of all of the millions of words that were flung at me that actually were useful. I have a concept that I call the meaning ratio, which is the number of meaningful words in any communication divided by the total number of words. And the meaning ratio of tech press releases is as low as just about anything that I could imagine. But that wasn't really the impetus for writing that book. When I left Forrester, I said, well, if I wanted to be an analyst, I would have stayed at Forrester. I was done with this analyzing technology thing. But I said, well, what do I know that other people don't know? And at Forrester, people pay a fair amount of money for those research reports. And there's a very high demand on brevity, clarity, on expressing yourself logically, on gathering information and then presenting it in a way that people can understand. And those principles are just as valuable if you're writing an email that's going to be seen by 150 people at your company as they are in a Forrester Research report. And of course, I read millions of other kinds of communications when I was at Forrester and started to apply those same principles. And that's why, that's sort of the genesis of where that book came from, was to take some of what I learned about clear, direct communication and put it all together in one place where people could get a look at it.
And prior to that, you had that book with Charlene Lee. What was it called?
Yes, my first book with Charlene was called Groundswell,
Right.
a book on social media that came out in 2008. And that was extremely successful. That book has sold over 150,000 copies. There are still some poor college students who are getting it assigned as a required text. And I say poor college students because the case studies on MySpace in there may no longer be very relevant for them. But that was a great example of engaging writing, very different from the kinds of writing that we did in our research reports, on a topic that was at exactly the right moment and that was heavy in case studies in how people were actually dealing with this in corporate environments. And the success of that book really has enabled both Charlene and me to build careers since then as authors, and in her case, as somebody who started her own company that was very successful.
But a very different approach from a business standpoint, right? Because my understanding is that Forrester, charges clients for access to research and for access to analysts, and for access to reports and research, but that Altimeter just published everything and made it available.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the book and Forrester's typical way of doing things and Altimeter and sort of look at those as a contrast. Forrester has a large number of analysts, hundreds of analysts, and so the idea that you would want to subscribe to a stream of information from that number of people, there's a lot of value there. It's expensive to create, and therefore that was a successful model for them. In Charlene's case, when she started her company, she only had a few analysts, and as a result, it would be very difficult to charge a subscription for the output of 3 people or 5 people. But by giving them away for free, you can still communicate the value of what you're doing, the quality of the research, and turn that into revenue from other things like consulting and inquiries. It's interesting if you look at the book we did, that obviously, Forrester doesn't sell research that costs $20. And yet you got this enormous lump of really valuable stuff in the book for just a few bucks. But it created such a reputation for us that Charlene was able to create her own company based off of that reputation, and I was able to help Forrester to become known as sort of the premier company in analyzing social media, and I ended up giving over 200 speeches based on what was in that book. So while we gave away the content at a relatively low price, it paid off in the long run in terms of the reputation of the organization.
Let's talk for a minute about the relationship between control and credibility. My experience has been particularly with content marketing or really even blogging, if it's trade oriented about a specific community. You can't be too honest, because if you upset anybody, then, you're persona non grata and you'll get iced out of future opportunities. And so I think a lot of people, and I think this is probably true in the analyst community too. I mean, how do you handle it when you're writing a report and there's just a piece of shit technology out there and they're a client, and you want to be straight, but you got to wear kid gloves? I mean, how do you deal with that?
I think you're mischaracterizing the way that research analysts at places like Forrester and Gartner operate, because they don't have kid gloves. You can have $1 million client and you can say that their technology is terrible. What you can't say, and this is really important, and we never did this and no one ever should, is you can't say that the executive is stupid, right? So we don't have any ad hominem attacks. But if it was, you really should not be upgrading to the next version of Oracle's database because it doesn't perform well. If Oracle has a $3 million contract, you still say that. And the fact is that you might gain some short-term benefit by not telling the truth, but in the long run, once you've sold your integrity, you have nothing left. And that was very much the philosophy at Forrester. You'd give the salesperson a heads up. You'd listen carefully when they tried to plead their case, but in the end, you told the truth.
But there's this saying that you hear in trade journalism, do no harm.
We did plenty of harm.
You're not there to harm the industry. You're there to help it grow. And you're not that you're going to be dishonest, but you're going to be gentle.
I'm so sorry to hear that. We look at Forrester Research, and this is true of any analyst that you can trust. There was only one goal, which was to give the best possible advice to users. So who are users? These are people who buy technology. And that means that if big companies should not be investing in AI right now, you say big companies should not be investing in AI right now, even though you're not helping the industry. Well, that industry is made up of vendors, and in the long run, the users will be grateful to you for giving what's the right advice.
How does this apply to content marketers who are, being tasked to create compelling content to get people interested in products and services if the products and services aren't quite ready? I mean, it's not the same as being a journalist, because
let's address that. Okay, so if you're doing content marketing and you work for a company, which there's huge numbers of people doing this, you must make sure that your content is as valuable as possible. So it might be how to prepare yourself for conversations with IT about a new technology. It might be, here are the 6 steps to take to make sure that your PC is ready for the next upgrade. It could be just about anything that would be useful and valuable content for the person reading it. Now, the equation is supposed to be, that's really useful content. It gets shared, it gets spread, it ranks on search. People come in, they read it, they find it valuable, and then they say, oh, who are these guys? And then they look into who wrote it or the organization that wrote it, and then they become interested in their products. If the products suck, in the end, that's a product problem. It's not really a content marketing problem. And yeah, maybe you shouldn't have ramped up the content marketing until you actually had something to sell. But the content marketer's challenge is to be as useful as possible in ways that are actually going to attract the kind of people that are interested in the company's products.
So, in journalism, perhaps, amongst technology buyers, we welcome whistleblowers. We want someone who's going to tell us the truth. We want
interesting choice of words right now. Yeah,
a contrarian point of view. But when it comes to content marketing, we don't. Yet it's so difficult today to discern between the two, even amongst analysts. Like, sometimes there are reports that are written that have these long disclaimers on them that they're not, maybe official research. I think I was reading, It was a sales enablement platform that I won't mention,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a white paper that I downloaded, and it was by a popular research group. But it said in there, this is not actual research. This is speculative. There was some like big disclaimer on the front of it.
Well, look, there are research companies that you can hire to do work for you. And they have a certain reputation, which is that they'll say what you need them to say. If you look at legit research companies like Forrester and Gartner, and some of the smaller ones like Horses for Sources, for example, they're not really going to be doing that. And while some of these organizations have consulting arms, and some of the consulting arms are available to do those kind of papers, and you might even see the name of an analyst on it, you want to pay close attention to whether this is part of the actual stream of research or whether it was produced by the consulting group and has a disclaimer on it. And in order to maintain the brands of those research companies, they do try and make sure that those pieces, when they get produced, are clearly identified as not being part of the normal research stream of that company.
In a report from Annenberg USC last year, they predict that we're approaching an age where people not only are not going to know the difference between journalism and influencer shared content and social media, but they're not even going to care. And you had mentioned earlier, the 2016 political environment as an opportunity to look at language. And I was having lunch with a friend who works for a well-known think tank this week, and he was telling me, our job is to provide truthful information to policymakers so we can help them make laws based on responsible information. And policymakers increasingly don't care about the truth anymore. I mean, are we approaching an age where truth doesn't matter?
Oh God, I want to kill myself now. I'm so sorry to hear that soliloquy that you were talking about. It's interesting that you bring this up because I find myself in the same situation as some academics that I know. My cousin happens to be a very senior and well-known economist. His name is Lynn Berman, and he works for a place called the Tax Policy Center, which is nonpartisan. They do things like analyze when a tax plan comes out, how much money people are likely to save or lose as a result of that. And we're all stuck with this challenge of the difference between what is true and what is opinion. And the only thing I can say, having children who are now in college age, is that you need to work hard to educate people that there will continue to be a bunch of people who do know the difference, that there will be news media that you can trust, that don't spin things, that you can absorb information from a variety of different sources, including people you don't agree with, and that we just need to do everything possible to maintain this distinction. And it really doesn't help that we have senior politicians who are trying to mix things up and just make up their own facts. But in the end, if you know what you're looking at, you can tell the difference, and you learn who you can trust or not trust to actually deliver accurate information.
You remember the long tail, Chris Anderson's long tail?
Of course,
article?
yes.
Yeah. And the essential hypothesis at the beginning was when people have access to unlimited content, the notion of what's popular changes because the bottom 80% in aggregate outweighs the popularity of the top 20%. But when that gets into the world of information, and facts now are so commoditized, and it's so difficult to tell the difference between one or the other. I mean, how do you? It's not so easy now to recognize what is in fact true.
Well, you can triangulate, right? If you see it in the Wall Street Journal and you also see it in the Washington Post, and you look at the different perspectives that they have, then you can actually identify what might or might not be true. If you look at an organization that is producing information and there's an article that you agree with, and then the next article is about how Kim Kardashian is having Prince Andrew's baby, maybe I shouldn't be trusting this news source.
Well, it's easy enough if you say looking at the Journal and the Washington Post, which is pretty tough because, one leans left and one leans right. What's more likely is someone would see a delta between Fox and the Journal. And, they may agree, so they've triangulated what's essentially advocacy journalism.
Well, like I said, you need to expose yourself to as wide a variety of information as possible. There's also a lot more direct information. Right now, as we're speaking, people are testifying in the impeachment hearings. And you can tune in and see what they're saying. And nobody's, sure, there's commentators who are talking about them, but you can judge for yourself whether you think somebody's telling the truth or not and what the meaning of what they're talking about is.
Well, you and I can, because we're information workers.
Yes.
But, most people are not. And most people don't have time because they're out there working and they have jobs and they have to pay bills and put shoes on their kids' feet. So the reality is they're going to go to this, they're going to gravitate to the soundbite after the fact. Yeah. And as long as advocacy journalism is driving that soundbite, finding truth is not so easy.
I think that there is hope here. And that hope has to do with people who can be both persuasive and honest. Also, people check each other. There's fact checkers, and if you publish something that's not right, I can come out and explain the evidence I have for why you're not right. It's a very vigorous environment, and frankly, if you don't want to see anything except from one side, it's hard to wall yourself off that much. I think that organizations like Facebook and Twitter are encouraging this division just by the way that they filter news. But in the end, there will be such a thing as truth, and it will make a difference. And if you look at things like Democratic governors getting elected in mostly Republican states, or here in Massachusetts, we have a Republican governor in a state that's very much a Democrat-leaning state, people are willing to consider more than one alternative. And the best communicators are the ones that are likely to be successful in the next set of elections.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's something you help people do, is communicate. Okay. So why are so many tech executives publishing books right now? Well,
it really is a content marketing environment. So I'll give you an example. I can't go into too much detail on this, but I ghost wrote a book last year called The Age of Intent. It's a book about artificial intelligence and chatbots, and the author is a guy named P.V. Kanan, who is the CEO of 247.ai, which is one of the AI companies. And as a result of that book being out, we had Thomas L. Friedman, the famous New York Times columnist, write about the company and about some of the information in the book. I just got information that there's an organization that's going to be giving away 1,000 copies of the book to all of their clients. It also means that PV is much more credible when he goes out there, and he has a more mature set of arguments from which to draw when he goes out and represents the company. So if a company has a point of view, and there's research to back it up or case studies to back it up, then it's possible for those corporate executives to get that word out by putting a book together, whether they write it themselves, which many of them do, or whether they work with an editor or a ghostwriter in order to get that information out there.
Now, when you say ghostwriter, is that, PV with Josh Bernoff, or is it completely invisible?
No, I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't public. It does say right. P.V. Kanan with Josh Bernoff.
So you're not a ghostwriter?
Well, I'm not an invisible ghostwriter. I mean, I typed all the words in there, but what it says reflects the point of view that PV has, and it's not my conclusions that are in there, even if I did the research and put the words together.
And what's the process? Walk us through how that goes. So if someone's hiring you to help them write a book and they don't have time, how are you able to write a book on behalf of someone else when you're not that person?
Well, it's interesting. I've now ghostwritten 2 books. The other one was for some executives at a company called Celigent, which is a marketing services company. And the processes were not at all the same, but of course they have a lot of commonalities. First of all, how do you find a ghostwriter? Well, I'm certainly happy to talk to people who are interested in working with me. There are other people like Shell Israel that are doing this now, or you can go to an organization like Gotham Ghostwriters, which actually will locate the best ghostwriter for you. And that book that I wrote for PB Kanan, I wrote under the auspices of Gotham Ghostwriters. They're the ones who connected us up together. Now, once you get connected, it's a question of what's the main idea. That's something you work out together. What are the subsidiary ideas? You work that out. Where are the case studies going to come from? What research can we put together? What perspective do you want to have? And then it's the ghostwriter's job to pull that all together and create chapters that actually say something. And it is the author's job, these are the executives, to look at that and say, okay, you didn't quite represent what I was trying to say this way. We'd rather say more about this and less about that. The order of things is wrong here. You made a blanket statement here that it isn't quite right. There is also a process of discovery where as a ghostwriter, you're basically interviewing the author. And that's why these books reflect the perspective of the author, because I get into their head and understand, all right, how does this person think? What is this person's perspective? And I'll just say this, I will not ghostwrite a book whose thesis I disagree with, because I couldn't put myself in that position and try and be persuasive. Sort of like what you do with PR, where you're trying to represent your client's goals, but at some point it's like, okay, I can't represent you because I don't believe in what you're doing.
What are some of the best tech books you've read lately?
I'm fascinated with this book I've been reading called Because Internet. It's a book by an academic, a linguist actually, who has studied the way that people express themselves online in places like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and how that's actually changed the language. Different generations using emojis in different ways, for example. And there's never been a linguist who was able to do this before, because the informal language that we all use was not written down. Now we're all using informal language and writing it down in places like Twitter and Facebook. And so she can go and study huge masses of data and write about that. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago called Everybody Lies, from a researcher at Google. And he was able to look at the huge corpus of information about what people were searching for. He also pulled data from places like Pornhub about what kind of porn people were looking at. And he was able to show that what people say they believe is not the same as what they actually do when they think nobody's looking. And I guess the reason these things attract me is because there's this huge mass of data now, and people are coming in and making interesting observations about it.
It seems like that theme of the divide between what people say and what they do is becoming almost a cultural theme. I was watching that new show on Apple TV Plus called The Morning Show with Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon. And she plays pretty much, someone who won't allow her handlers to keep her on message. She's going to be honest, and she's going to get the network, upset. And they all want her to shut up. But at the end of the day, the viewers like it, and they're rewarded with ratings. She really is, there's this concept, I mentioned I was going to talk about a little bit of, just mention briefly, I just finished this. This is Talking to Strangers with Malcolm Gladwell, and he mentions in it a Russian archetype that he finds in Russian literature called the Holy Fool. And the Holy Fool is sort of an eccentric, ne'er-do-well who is outcast from society, but nonetheless speaks the truth. And you see this type of character more and more now. We're looking; these people are becoming more and more important because no one says what they do. And, I was recently down at USC where they released a report called the Relevance Report. And one of the things they talk about in the report is the rise in student suicides. What is the human cost of a world where no one does what they say? What is the impact? Does it create anxiety? Everyone's talking about the fact that global climate change is a problem. No one's doing anything about it.
Okay, well, what a soliloquy we have to deconstruct now that you just did. First of all, hypocrisy is not new. Whoa, we've had hypocrisy for a long time.
There's a difference between hypocrisy and elected officials denying the truth.
Elected officials denying the truth is hypocrisy, or at least denying the truth about who they are.
Well, no, elected officials not admitting that they do what they say they shouldn't do is different than denying that it ever happened in the first place.
Lying isn't new either, and we just need to, I think, develop better skills for sorting these things out. This suicide rate thing is certainly challenging thing that's upsetting to me and to anyone else who's got friends that are young people. But I don't. I think part of the deal is that our connections now are moderated through devices, and to whatever extent we can create connections that are more human, that are more actual in-person connections, I think if we can do that, we're more likely to have the help we need when you get yourself feeling down and you need somebody to give you a reason to live. I wish I could solve the suicide problem, but I'm not a psychologist.
There is a positive message to talking to strangers, and it basically he says that society relies on us assuming the best in others when we talk to strangers. It's tragic when our trust gets violated, but most of the time it doesn't. So what he basically says is what we get in exchange for being vulnerable to an occasional lie is efficient communications and social coordination.
Yeah. Well,
and some of the examples he gives, he says, if we assumed everyone was Bernie Madoff, there'd be no Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
If we assumed that all coaches and people who are in youth athletics were predators, there'd be no youth athletics. So really, it's tragic when it gets violated, but most of the time it doesn't. And there's no perfect way to peer into the minds of others. So we should stop penalizing ourselves and others for what he calls defaulting to truth. That's pretty much his book in a nutshell.
I will tell you this: it's been an interesting shift for me from being an analyst, because when you are an analyst, you're supposed to know everything, right? I was an expert in television. I'd go into a place like Comcast or NBC, and they would basically lob questions at me, and I needed to have an answer for all of it. And that gives you this feeling that, oh, I really must be pretty smart. And I know more than these other people because I've done this research. And it's true, we knew things, but we were wrong too. I was wrong plenty of times. And since leaving there, and now that I need to interact with people who may end up being clients, I'm a lot more tolerant. I talk to people and they're like, I want to write a book on this. And I think, not I'm smarter than you, but that's really interesting. It's amazing how many interesting things people know. And I think, well, I can help you to write that better, but not I'm smarter than you, because in the end, I have to have some humility. You cannot serve clients without having some humility. And I think that in general, that's given me a much more of a feeling of connection with the people that I work with. And I hope that's reflective of what you're talking about in society generally, that that person who cuts you off with their car, maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe that person in the supermarket who you bumped into can say, I'm sorry, and you can say, I'm sorry, and you can just move on instead of believing that everyone is evil and out to get you.
Well, just to close the loop on the Annenberg report, The issues that are cited are suicide, homelessness, climate change, access to health care. These all being issues that young people are concerned with. And then you look at the world of these corporate social responsibility programs that corporations are undertaking to try to improve these things. And at the end of the day, homelessness is still up. The planet's still getting warmer. It's still, access to health care is still tough. Suicide rates are increasing. So I think, if you look, there must be a cost. Something is driving these things, up. There must be
again, we need to have a little perspective. There was a generation before us who was like, there are too many nuclear weapons. Nobody's doing anything about it. Well, it takes a long time to change societal thinking. There was an idea that we all ought to be able to have access to health care. And now there is an Affordable Care Act. And there are people talking about ways to expand that on the Democratic side. So you say, nothing changes, but something actually did change. There was an EPA. There are people at work on finding ways to verify the truth about journalist content. So I think that there's still forces in the world that are trying to change these things. It just takes a long time. Global warming is not one of these things that it's like, we figured it out. Now we'll actually solve the problem, and then we can move on to, figuring out who's going to win on Dancing with the Stars.
So back to books for a second here.
Okay.
When you're working with people, helping them improve their writing, what do they get wrong most of the time?
I'm going to tell you that the biggest mistake people make has nothing to do with what's in the books. They put an enormous amount of effort into creating a really good book, and then they're like, oh man, that was a whole lot of work. Thank God that's over. And then there's like a 4 or 5 month period before the book comes out, and they're asleep at the switch. No, a book is something that needs feeding. It needs promotion. This is where we need to hire publicity people and do outreach. And publishers, by the way, their publicity departments tend to be pretty weak, so you have to do a lot of it yourself if you're an author. And if you don't do that, people are like, why didn't anybody buy my book? Well, because it was a great book, but you didn't put the energy into promoting it. You didn't build up a social media following. You didn't go out and do public speaking. You didn't get Thomas L. Friedman to write about it, and all the other, dozens of other things that people can do. As far as the content of the book goes, I've seen people do all sorts of things wrong, but the biggest challenge is this. No one wants to read your content unless it has stories in it. And that means case studies. So if you look at The Age of Intent, the book about AI that I was talking about, we have actual case studies about people who tried to use this to reduce the amount of humans that are necessary to answer questions at places like Dish Network, and how they succeeded, or what challenges they faced. And that interests people. Well, case studies don't just like fall in your lap, and they can't all be your client stories either. So the work of actually finding those stories and putting them into the context is what makes the difference between a book that people actually read and like versus a book that they see, they start in, and then they put it on the night table and never come back to it again.
Yeah, it is the stories, isn't it? I mean, I read a ton, and often the topic in and of itself, if it's something I'm interested in, will keep me going, even though it may not be that great of a book in terms of how it's written. But, when you do pick up a Gladwell book, or really any of these, like I'm reading Blitzscaling now, it's at another level. It's more enjoyable. You read it quicker.
I have to say that Gladwell is both the best storyteller, and you got to be careful. Gladwell is such a good storyteller that he can take a very thin collection of information and make it persuasive. So you could look back at some of the stuff that's in his books. People are like, well, actually, it turns out that 10,000 hours thing isn't quite the same as what he was saying it was. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that you have to put the stories in there, but it helps to have statistics on your side, clear arguments, quoting people in authority, and all of the other ingredients that go into actually making something right and not just persuasive.
I actually asked him about that, and he kind of, I mean, I don't want to paraphrase what he said, and I'll give you my understanding of his answer. But basically what I got from him was, conclusions are somewhat opinion. To make a conclusion from a bunch of facts, I mean, involves causation, correlation, and speculation. And so, you don't really know what adds up to something else. You take your best guess. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong.
Well,
but you should entertain people in the process.
Yes. And this is not so much a criticism as an admiration. That you need to be persuasive and you need to have actual facts and put them together in the right way. And this is one of the things that you learn as an analyst is, first of all, to have an open mind, right? Sometimes you find things that are different than what you expected. And then to actually how to assemble that into a persuasive argument. I'm just going to cite one example here because I think it's relevant. We had a lot of data at Forrester Research, consumer data. In fact, I helped to create the part of Forrester that collected the consumer data called technographics. And at one point, one of the data people came to me and said, I'm looking at this question about blogs, and it says that people don't trust corporate blogs. But we can't write about that because, you're talking about social media. And I'm like, no, that's exactly what we need to write about. If you find in the data something that is surprising, that's exactly what you need to do. Even if it goes against whatever it was that you were thinking, that new truth is what people need to hear about.
I was recently at a conference with a bunch of vendors, and I had to put together a roundup piece on the offerings from those vendors, and most of those vendors wouldn't talk to me. And I honestly wasn't sure how to handle that. I didn't want to throw anybody under the bus with sour grapes, but then at the same time, so I wound up mostly on review sites, trying to figure out, what people thought of their products from that.
You got to be clever in the way you collect the data. And certainly, I think there's so many news organizations and analysis organizations now that the job of a corporate PR person in technology is harder than it's ever been before, and having to deal with just a huge volume of influencers and analysts and trade magazines and online only magazines and everything else that goes into creating the mass of content that we now all consume.
If you were writing a roundups article or doing research on a bunch of different vendors and a vendor stonewalled you, but you wanted to have them in the report, what would you do? Well,
we used to run into that problem all the time at Forrester, and what you do is you find their customers. So power comes from talking to the customers, and they're like, we're not going to tell you about what's in version 3. It's like, okay, well, let me talk to a customer. And they're like, oh yeah, I installed version 3 and my server melted down. Oh, okay. So if you really want me to get my information from that, and then you go back to the vendor and say, so this customer said your server melted down. And they're like, so let us tell you what the real truth is. But in order to get people to answer your questions, you need to have influence. In order to have influence, you need to have a reputation you've built up over a while. And frankly, until that happens, you can understand why they may not be putting the energy into responding to you.
In terms of did you ever do like a demo where, you said you were something other than an analyst so you could get a look at a product?
No, I never lied. There's no need to do that.
You never just I'm not saying lie, but you never just signed up for a demo with a salesperson?
No,
went that route?
no, that would be inappropriate. So no, I mean, we didn't. I look. It's not really appropriate for me to go into detail about what we did at Forrester, but in general, we did not misrepresent who we were doing or how we were doing it.
Sure.
And when you know that many people in the industry, if something is not quite right, you're going to find out sooner or later.
Let's talk about getting published.
Okay.
So I read a book in 2013 with Paul Gillen.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very lucky because Paul is a professional editor.
Mm-hmm.
And he pretty much, made sure everything was right.
Mm-hmm.
I just had to contribute content and experience. And so we sort of split up the chapters. He sort of edited the whole thing, and we got it to market through Wiley.
Mm-hmm.
Wiley and Sons was the publisher. So if someone wants to not just write a book, but have it published
Mm-hmm.
by an authoritative publisher like Wiley or someone of that level,
Mm-hmm.
how do they go about it?
Well, I end up advising a lot of authors who are trying to figure out how to get published. And there's basically 3 paths to publication. The first one is the one that you took, which is to go out to traditional publishers. And in order to do that, you need to write a really good book proposal. And that in itself is a challenge. If people are interested in more detail on that, if you search how to write a book proposal that will make publishers drool, you'll find my blog post on that topic. And I talk about all of the details that go into that. But among the most important things these days is the marketing plan, which shows how you're actually going to sell books, because that's what the publisher is interested in. You mentioned Wiley. I talked recently to Richard Naramore, who was the acquisitions editor for business at Wiley, and he now is looking for proof that you can sell 10 to 20,000 copies. Now, that doesn't mean you're like signing on the dotted line, but he wants to see in your marketing plan what you're going to do that actually has a chance of selling that much. Now, if you can't do that, or more importantly, if you're not willing to wait, because it often takes 15 to 18 months to get a book published that way, there are 2 other paths. There is what's called hybrid publishing, in which you hire a publisher to produce a book for you. And this used to be what people called vanity press, and it had a very bad reputation. But these days, these hybrid publishers are doing every bit as good a job on producing the books, on getting them into distribution, on doing some of the publicity and marketing, and everything else that a publisher would do. The only difference is you pay them up front instead of getting an advance. And actually, if the book sells a lot, you can make more money that way because the royalties are higher and you have a lot more control. The 2 books that I ghost wrote last year were both published by Amplify, which is an imprint of Mascot Books, and that's a hybrid publisher that we had a pretty good experience with. And my last book at Forrester, which was called The Mobile Mind Shift, we did with Greenleaf Book Group, which is another similar kind of group. Of course, the third thing you can do is to self-publish, and that's fast and cheap. So I edited a book by Robert Scoble and Shel Israel called The Fourth Transformation, a book on augmented reality and AI. They self-published that. That was the second book they had self-published that way. And you basically hire the people to do the page layout and the copy editing and the editing. Like I said, they hired me to do that. And then you just put it up on Amazon, and people can buy it either as an ebook or as a print-on-demand paperback. And if you get one of those print-on-demand books, they look pretty much just like any other paperback. Of course, at that point, you don't have a publisher's imprint. It's much harder to make a big impact. But if you want to get yourself into print quickly, it's quite doable to do that. And I'm helping a number of authors who are doing that right now.
So, obviously you're a famous guy. I mean, you've been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
I mean, you really, when there was any report,
Mm-hmm.
when you were at Forrester, big in the news, you were the guy that got the quote. So I got to think you're expensive. How does somebody grapple with what it's going to cost to hire somebody of your scale and stature to help them?
That's interesting how you went from my getting quoted in the New York Times to what my prices are. The fact is, the reason I am relatively high priced as an editor or a ghostwriter is because of my experience. You don't usually get 20 years as a Forrester analyst along with that, and that's some people are willing to pay for that level of quality. But if you want a ghostwriter, there are people who are cheaper than me. If you want an editor, there are so many people who have been downsized out of the publishing industry are now available, and can do that cheaper than I can do it. And so, and if you want to self-publish, there are hundreds of providers who will help you with that. So there's a whole vibrant ecosystem out there. And frankly, if somebody comes to me and I talk to them and they're like, "You're too expensive," I will refer them to people who will be better suited to their needs, because they end up happy. My friend who gets the business ends up happy, and who knows when that comes back to, they come back to me on the next book when they have a bigger budget.
Can you talk numbers at all? A range of what these things cost?
Well, for me, if we're talking about ghostwriting a book all the way from beginning to end, from the conception of the idea through creation of a proposal, through the writing and so on, it probably ends up coming to somewhere in the $80,000 to $100,000 range. I know people who will do that for $40,000, but they don't have the same level of experience with writing about marketing or business. And it's interesting. There are books I won't do. You're doing a memoir. You don't want me to ghostwrite your memoir, because the value I have is in understanding business and technology and marketing. The things I have to offer to someone who's writing a memoir, I'm probably worse than the ghostwriter who specializes in that. As far as editing goes, I have to say it's very much a sliding scale, because it depends on how good or bad your writing is. I've had editing projects that I did for $10,000 because they were relatively short books by people whose writing was pretty good. And I've had campaigns that were my own little Vietnam type quagmire, trying to wrestle content into shape so it was any good. And of course, that costs more, because that's a much bigger effort. But I'd say typically, as far as editing goes, if you're looking at a high-end editor, you're probably looking at something in the $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 range, unless your book is relatively short, or you want to go with someone who has less knowledge of the topic.
What is relatively short? I mean,
well,
let's talk word count.
Okay, yeah. So these days, I'd say if you go back 2 or 3 years ago, typical business book was about 65,000 words. And when that gets into print in a hardback, you're looking at probably 250 pages. So that you can, that people used to holding that book in your hand, that's about what that is. Books are getting shorter, partly because people's attention spans are getting shorter. And I've worked on books that were 40,000 words, 45,000 words, more like 200 pages. And they're still viable. It's just, less tonnage, and as a result, less effort. Now I'm working right now on a book, editing a book that's came in at 80,000 words. And that was after we had done as much squeezing and chopping off of things as we could. But the author just was in love with certain topics and would not let them go. And I think that becomes a challenge. Both every 10,000 words requires more effort on the part of the editor. It's more pages to print. The book has to be more expensive. It's harder for the reader. And it's a challenge, really, unless your topic is so fascinating that people are willing to sit still for a little longer.
Josh, thanks for taking the time to do this. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to contact you?
Well, you can email me at josh@bernoff.com. And if you go to bernoff.com or withoutbullshit.com, you'll be able to see my blog, and you can sign up and see what kind of stuff I'm writing about every day.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, it was great catching up with you. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Okay. It was good to talk to you again, Eric.
Take care.
Bye-bye.